To the Introduction to Sensitivity Analysis. I'm Ken Frank. I'm at Michigan State University. With my colleagues, we've developed the KonFound-It app, which you'll learn a little bit more about. This work was sponsored by the Institute of Education Sciences, the U.S. federal government. If you want to access this PowerPoint, which has a bunch of hyperlinks within it, you can scan this QR code, and we'll be learning about diagrams like this. So sensitivity analysis really starts off when, as a social scientist, we find that X causes Y. We see there's a relationship there. And because of that, we make maybe a call for action. And that would be in the context of policy social science. When we call for that action, we are going to engage the public, and not just one public, but multiple publics, lots of groups of people. And when we do so, basically what we're doing is with that action call, we're calling for a reallocation of resources. This could be money, but it could be in the context of education research, which I do a lot of. We're going to call for teachers to be trained differently, or get some professional development or hiring of different types of teachers. Well, there might be folks, well-meaning, who say, we don't really like that new allocation of resources, and we're going to challenge it, and we're going to challenge it by saying you cannot prove that X causes Y. You cannot prove that hiring a certain type of teacher really improves achievement or something like that. And because you cannot prove it, we're going to take away that action and keep the resources where they are. So the pragmatic social scientist says, okay, I know I can't prove it, but is there enough evidence to act? So instead of the solid black line, we're going to just say, is there a dashed line? Is there strong enough evidence? And if there is, we can take the action, again with the dashed arrow, and allocate the resources even before we even wait for proof. The classic example of sensitivity analysis articulates the ideas that we have here, started with the effect of smoking on lung cancer. And if there were findings that smoking caused lung cancer, this would be through the 1950s. And there were various calls to action, including the control of marketing of tobacco products, the sale, et cetera, taxation. And that was an allocation of resources. And then Fisher, R.A. Fisher, was a very famous statistician, said, you cannot prove that smoking causes cancers. Fisher, with his pipe in hand, said that. And so then the pragmatic social scientist would say, okay, I know I can't prove it, but is there enough evidence to act? And so here's Fisher in his own words in a very famous journal called Nature, and it was written in the late 1950s. He wrote other pieces as well. And he says both characteristics, smoking and lung cancer, might be largely influenced by a common cause, a genotype. And you can read where Fisher said that here. Well, along comes Jerome Cornfield and colleagues, and they say, it's not necessarily about proving, but it's about a dialogue with the public. And so they talk about recent evidence and a discussion of some questions, and they're going to take on Fisher a bit. They wrote a technical appendix that Paul Rosenbaum later summarized very nicely. And here's Rosenbaum's summary of what Cornfield et al. Found. They found that such the unobserved characteristic, Fisher's gene, would need to be a near perfect predictor of lung cancer and about 9 times more common among smokers than among non-smokers. And then they say, while this sensitivity analysis does not rule out the possibility that such a characteristic might exist, it does clarify what a scientist must logically be prepared to assert in order to defend such a claim. I want to highlight 2 parts of this quote. First is Cornfield et al., with technical work, are figuring out exactly what the properties of that omitted variable, that gene, must be to change the inference. So now it's just not a question of whether such a thing exists, what must its properties be? And in this case, they're very extreme properties that have to be a near perfect predictor of lung cancer and 9 times more common among smokers than among non-smokers. That's what it would take to change your mind. And then the second part is they're not changing the inference per se. They're informing the way we're going to talk about the inference. They're anticipating a dialogue that we're going to have about the inference because we're talking about what the scientists must be logically prepared to assert. That's anticipating a discussion. It turns out that they found Fisher's gene in the late 2008. And there is such a gene that causes that predicts smoking. And if you have that gene and you smoke, you're more likely to get lung cancer. But then later work by Tyler Vanderweel and colleagues found that that gene nowhere near explains the relationship between smoking and lung cancer. The relationship is so strong, it would take an overwhelming alternative explanation to change your inference. And there's some complexity to the phenomenon with some interaction terms and mediation. You can read about it here. So there are similar challenges to making inferences in other areas in health, surgery, education, economics, management, environmental sciences, psychology, just to name a few. Some of these are would we consider vintage or classic, and others are quite contemporary. And so this kind of conversation is ongoing. Our group has two frameworks for sensitivity analysis. One is the robustness of inference to replacement. We're going to say to nullify your inference, blank percent. What percent of your data would have to be replaced with data for which there was no effect? So here you're thinking about your data and how it would have to change your mind. The second framework is the impact threshold for a confounding variable, the ITCV. And there we'd say to nullify your inference, an omitted confounding variable would have to be correlated with the focal predictor in the outcome at some level. This second approach is closer in spirit to what Cornfield did and what Rosenbaum was quoting. Both frameworks are user-friendly and statistically rigorous. I think they're intuitive. We aim to make them easy to interpret. They can be applied to most analyses, one framework or the other. They're technically sound. They are rooted in the fundamental calculations, estimation approaches that we use when we're estimating models. And they're computationally straightforward. You can do them in R, Stata, we have an app, the R Shiny app, or Excel. Here's the website that we have where you can learn more about this. It includes a link to the app over on the right-hand side here. The website's up on the left, the app's over on the right. With the app, you just put in the type of analysis you want and a few pieces of conventionally reported quantities, such as an estimated effect, a standard error, and a sample size, and it's able to do the calculations. You can read about news and benchmarking and all sorts of other things at the website. We have many related academic papers. Here's just a set of them on the website. A fuller set is listed. Again, if this is if you want to access this PowerPoint, here's the QR code. In future videos, we'll be talking about the ITCV and RAR frameworks in more detail. Thanks for listening.